Y'all, it's 8:35. We're gonna get started real quick. So, just some quick announcements. A2 is due tomorrow night at 11:59. Please finish that if you haven't finished it already. We released mentorship matchings. There were about like 35 of y'all that filled out the mentorship matching form. I've released it to the course staff, so they should be reaching out to you soon. And then A3, we're going to release it tomorrow. It is a 2-week long assignment. And so after Wednesday's lectures, you will be able to do the first, I believe, 2 parts. Because it is a 2-week long assignment, make sure y'all don't procrastinate like me and do it last minute. But try to finish it or start it early. There is a midpoint check-in that is for completion, but we will give y'all feedback on that. So just make sure that by the end of next Tuesday or the Tuesday after that, make sure that y'all finish the up to the midpoint. If you need a partner, please fill out the matching form, and I'll pair you with your old partner for A2. But if your partner ditched you, then just shoot me an email, and I can just remove y'all. Okay. Are there any questions about announcements? All right, so just to recap what we learned last lecture, we basically introduced this architecture called MVC. MVC stands for Model, View, and Controller. So an architecture is just basically how we kind of write our code base. And so we have these models, which basically represents all of our data. And then we have a view, which is basically what the users see. And so now what a controller does is that it communicates between those models and views. So for example, if a user clicks on this button view, then the model gets updated, and then if the model gets updated, the view reads that new data, and then it updates the view for the user. And then we also discussed how to kind of navigate between view controllers, and so we can do this by pushing and popping, as well as presenting and dismissing. We didn't really go over presenting and dismissing, but it's basically the same syntax kind of, same idea. And then we also discussed how delegation is normally used to communicate from a child to a parent. So the child is usually the delegator, and in order to communicate back with the parent, you have to define a protocol in which this protocol contains functions in which the delegate will have to implement. And then that's kind of how you communicate between the child and the parents. So that was basically everything for lecture 3. Are there any questions? Yes.
Wait, so is delegate a word used describing somebody uses a protocol, or is it a specific thing for the architecture that you're talking about?
Yeah, so delegation is kind of like a pattern. It's called the delegation pattern. It's just a common CS term, but it's not specific to just Swift and all that stuff. Any other questions? Okay. So today we'll go over this new kind of view. It's called a UITableView. So before we only explore basic views, static views that don't really, I guess you can't really scroll through it. But now most of the apps that you use, Instagram for example, Spotify, those views or those apps are usually scrollable. So today we'll discuss a UITableView, which is a type of scroll view.
So we'll jump right into this. So yeah, as been said earlier, we're moving into sort of more complex views, something that's scrollable, something that sort of takes in actual more coherent or representation of data. So before we sort of just typed in text, or we took text from somewhere and we inputted it. In this case, we can sort of take an entire array or set of data and sort of convert it into visual representation. So this is also where sort of our MVC architecture also comes in, because each of these cells, if you see up here, each of these represents sort of a model. So on the left here with Spotify, you can see that each song has sort of the model, which consists of an image, a name, and an artist, as well as maybe even a time that it takes for the song to play. So that model you can represent using sort of a UITableView cell like here. So each one of these, this entire thing here is the UITableView. And each one of these rows is represented by a UITableView cell here, which we'll go into more detail later on in this lecture. But as you can see, this is sort of how you represent an array or set of data that you either, in this case, will actually be hard coding in, but later on will actually be fetching from a backend. So this is sort of where it becomes more relevant that we use our data to update or use our models / data to update our views and vice versa. So also here, if you see here, we have like the default settings page on your iPhone. So if you see here, it sort of breaks up into sections, but each section sort of have their own rows. So this will come important later on too, because in a table view, we sort of have these sections that you can specify here. And each of these sections has sort of a different indexing for each of those sections. So this is row 0 for section 0, and this is row 0 for section 1. So we sort of have this distinction between sections and rows that sort of separate your table view into sections, each of which has their own corresponding data by row. So we're going to go sort of move into a demo, sort of how to set up UITableView. If you want sort of more details about this, there is a section in the textbook as well. But yeah, this is sort of the view that we're trying to create here. So this is like, essentially, this is a bird table view, and we're trying to create sort of this representation where each one of these cells is a bird object representing one of our team members on the iOS team. And we sort of want to print out the data, or we want to like view the data in the form of a UI table view. Okay, so without further ado, let's go to the demo for today. So this is it, right? Yeah, okay, so yeah, if you actually get cloned, I'll give you guys time to clone, but this should be in the actual lecture section for today. So if you get cloned that link, you'll be able to follow along if you want to. Right now we're just on main, but when we sort of move on later, you can, so you don't have to worry about like copying everything. We have the saved version of sort of what I'm demoing now, so there's no worries if you can't keep up. Okay, so if you see here, we sort of have a basic view controller with sort of this data here. This will come more important later, but right now what we want to focus on is sort of this struct that we have right here representing our bird model. As I said before, we sort of use a table view to represent models, or like a list or array of models, right? So right here we have our model right here. This is the bird. And then we have our data represented here, which is sort of the list that we want to represent. So starting from this, we actually want to create our cell first. So if we create a new file, and we'll call it a what the bird table view cell. The space.
In the very beginning, I think you put space.
No. Okay, right. Okay, so we'll create that. You see here, I guess, new group. Why is this? The heck? What?
Sorry guys, our
Yeah,
Xcode is bugging.
This is very weird
Xcode
here.
is
This
a little
usually
stupid
should
sometimes.
not happen, but sometimes it has these errors with bird table.
Yeah, so what Richie
cell.
is doing right now is that he's creating the cell for each row inside of that table view. So earlier when you saw that table view with the bird and the name, each cell contains, so each cell is basically a view, and so that cell contains the image of the bird as well as the name. And he's just putting it inside this views folder.
Right, so yeah, the first thing you want to do actually is when you create the file, you want to import UIKit, otherwise we won't have access to any of UIKit sort of views that we're creating. So we want to define a class called bird TableView Cell. And then we actually want to make this a subclass of an existing class called UITableView Cell. But since UITableView Cell is sort of a general template class, we want to create our own custom one that sort of represents this bird object here. So the first thing we want to do is sort of set up our views. So you see earlier from the demo, from here, you see that we have an image and we have a label. So we actually want to set these here. So we have bird image. Right image. You have a question?
When I create the file in the view, I open the file, it doesn't open.
Wait, what doesn't open? The
When I created the file TableView set.
does it appear red like this here? Okay, so yeah, don't create it in the red folder. Like I would create a new folder called view and then add it to that. I don't know what's going on with the sort of it says if anything's red, I wouldn't just touch it. I would like try right click up here and create a new file rather than using. You can right click on any folder and then it says new file here.
Oh.
Yep, and you select the source file. Okay, so if you go back to the cell, so you want to create a UI image view, and then we have the bird name label to represent the name of the bird. So this is sort of what we have as the view representing each cell, right? So the next step is defining the initializer. We want to sort of know how we're going to create this bird table view cell. So we want to override init, and that. There we go. So you see that? It'll autocomplete. We want the one with the style that specifies the UITableView Cell style and the reuse identifier. This won't really be relevant in this demo, but you sort of usually want to use that initializer here. And then before we proceed, we want to actually call the super initializer and then pass in sort of these parameters as well to the super initializer so that we can sort of use the super class to sort of set up the basic sort of structure. And then if we click on this error here, it'll sort of add in that required initializer that you've seen before. So, okay, so the next step is I actually want to be able to set up the views. So setup. So we want to set up the image view. Okay, so we have our image view, and we want to sort of make. So the first thing we want to do is actually set the content mode of the image view. So this is sort of what indicates how we want the image to be displayed. So if you do content mode is equal to .scale aspect fit or fill is sort of the convention that we use in this class, or fit for now. Okay. So sort of to add, so before we proceed any further and constrain this to the view, what is the next step to sort of be able to display this view into the cell? Does anyone know? We've sort of set the properties. What is the next step that we're supposed to do right now? Yes.
Make the thing false.
Yes. Yes, that too, yes. But we specifically have to add the view to the screen as well, right? So yep, first thing he was right. We have to do bird image view dot translates auto, set that to false. And then we also want to add it to our sort of view. But keep in mind, this is not a view controller, so we don't have access to an actual view. In this case, what we actually have is a content view. You want to do content view to add subview, to add this view to the sort of view hierarchy of the cell itself. So we have bird image view here. And now we want to constrain it, and that's using NS layout. Constraint.activate. And then let's say we constrain it to the left. So bird image view dot leading anchor dot constrain is equal to content view dot leading anchor constant 16, and then bird image view dot center y anchor dot constraint is equal to content view dot center y anchor, and we want to do bird image view dot, we want to set the width as well equal to constant, which we'll set to 64. Okay, so far we've constrained the sort of image view to our table view at the moment, and what we want to do right now is actually call that in our initializer. So when our sort of table view cell is initialized, we can sort of set up the image view as well. So setup, image view. And then now that we have our image view, we also want to set up the label as well. So using sort of the same structure of adding a view, I want to set up the label. And we can do label, bird name label, dot text color, dot black, and then bird name label, dot font is equal to dot system font of size 20, and we'll do weight medium. So after we do that, we do the sort of same steps of setting auto translate masking into constraints into false. So bird label dot translate equals false, and then content view dot adds subview bird name label, and we also need to constrain this as well. So we actually want to constrain the leading of this to the trailing of the image view. So I don't know if we've demonstrated this earlier, but that leading anchor is equal to the trailing anchor of the image view. So we can do bird image view dot trailing anchor, and then constant, we'll set 8. And then we also want to constrain the center y again, so it's centered in the y-axis. Dot constraint equal to content view dot center y. And we also want to do the trailing, just in case we have like a really long name and we want to constrain that. So content view dot trailing anchor, and then we'll set that constant to -16. Okay. So we have the sort of image view, and we're setting up the image view as well as the label here. And then, yeah, so that should be the setup enough for the view. So right now, at the moment, we've only defined the bird TableView cell. And that's not really enough to sort of display anything at the moment because it's only the cell. We haven't actually defined the table that's going to display these cells. This one single cell is only representing sort of one bird object. But in the case where we have multiple, we want to sort of set up the table view that takes in these cells and represents a sort of an array of bird data objects. So that's sort of where the next step of this comes in dequeuing cells and creating a table view itself.
Yeah, so I'm just going to kind of quickly recap what Richie did, or kind of like the process to kind of creating this table view. So again, a table view is some kind of scroll view. So as you can see, this thing is scrollable. Now you notice how each cell basically kind of looks the same, right? So each cell has this image of this bird, and then it has this label representing the name of the bird. And so you can see that each cell inside of a table view cell should kind of have the same properties. And so if you, I don't know if I can pause this, but if you look at, I guess, like each cell, this whole thing represents the constant view of the cell. And so what Richie was basically doing is, so what we created was just basically a bird table view cell that represents that one entire cell. Now, just like how we did it in A2, you want to do the same thing when you configure a table view cell. So you have these properties that represents each view. So in this example, you have an image that represents the bird image, and then you have the label that represents the bird's name. And so basically we define the properties. Next, we configure those properties. So, the image, make the content mode aspect fit, so it scales and keeps its aspect ratio. And then the label, we just configured it with a color, text color, and then we configure the fonts. And then after you do that, you usually want to set this thing to false, and then add it to the content view this time. So whenever we create this entire thing, for A2, whenever we create the entire view controller, we did it based off of view, which represents the entire view. But now we use content view, which represents just this one cell. Does that make sense? Yes.
Like, does it recognize the word content? Because it's not like a variable you made or anything. Is content view that's something like you inherited and you made it?
Yeah, exactly. So this thing right here is a subclass of UITableView cell. So just like how you have a view controller, which is a subclass of UI view controller, there's this view property that is already being created inside of this UI view controller, so you inherit it. It's just the same thing with a UITableView cell. You inherit this thing called a content view that represents that one small cell. All right, does that make sense? Okay, so then again, we just constrain it based off of that content view. So like the image, for example, we set the center Y to be equal to the content view center Y. So this right here, this image is in the center of this cell. And then all the constraints is just the same thing as you've been doing in the past. Okay, so now that we've kind of created the cells already, we know what it looks like. We know what we want it to look like. Now it's time to actually create multiple cells by passing in our data. And so you can see that there's an issue though. What if we had thousands and millions of data? Each row represents one bird. So if you look at inside of this view controller, we have an array of birds. But what if we had more than this amount of birds? What if we had millions of data? Now, each cell, each row is some kind of view. And so imagine if you had millions of rows, that would take up a lot of storage and cause our app to, crash or, even have a memory leak. So we don't want that. We only want to allocate memory for the cells that are inside of our screen that we are seeing right now. So as I'm scrolling, all of the cells that are not on the screen, I don't want to allocate memory for it because it's just going to waste up a lot of storage. So there's this method called Dequeueing Cells that allows you to kind of save memory. And so basically what happens is that whenever you scroll the table view, all of the cells that are not on the screen, those are being dequeued. So for example, this, or like the top table view cell, as I scroll up, it's being dequeued and it's using that memory for another cell. And it can do that because these cells are alike. Each cell has a label, each cell has an image. So it's easy to simply just dequeue it and reuse the same properties. And so we use a reuse identifier to kind of identify which cells that are being dequeued. So for example, because all of these cells are alike, they will share the same reuse identifier so that when this table view gets scrolled, it knows which cells to reuse. All right, does that concept of dequeuing cells make sense? Any questions? Okay, so now that that's done, I'm going to quickly demo how to actually create the table view using this data right here. So first, this entire table view is a view. And so you could think of this table view as just like any other view that you've created in the past, such as a UI label or a UI image view. So I'm going to create a property for it first. So I'm going to say private let table view. That's going to be a UI table view. So I create the property for it. So now, just like any other view, I will need to configure it. And so I will create a function to help set it up. So I'm going to say private func setup table view. And then I'm going to call that inside of view.load. So whenever this view controller gets loaded on the screen, it's going to call this function to help set up the table view. And so now, before I kind of configure this property, we usually kind of want to configure first. I'm going to do that later and then just do what we normally did and by adding this table view to this main view. And so this entire table view, we want to add it to the view controller's view. So can someone remind me, how do I do that? Anyone? Yes. Exactly. So view, the add subview, and then I'm going to add this table view that I created. So add the table view. Next step, you want to do this long, stupid thing, set it equal to false. That basically just enables auto layout. And now we want to constrain this table view to the main view. And so we use NSLayout to activate the constraints. So I'm going to activate the constraints. And so now if you look at this image right here, this entire thing is a table view. So where do you think I should put the top anchor? Where should I constrain that to? Okay, so this table view, I'm going to constrain its top anchor, constrain that equal to the main view's top anchor. Because the top anchor of that table view, I want it to be at the very top. Same thing with every other view, or every other anchor. So the table view's bottom anchor, I also want to constrain that to the main view's bottom anchor. So the top and the bottom, that's good. Now I need the leading and then trailing. And so because this table view is all the way to the very left of this view, I'm just going to constrain that equal to the view as well. So table view, set its leading anchor equal to the view's leading anchor. And then remember to use leading anchor instead of left anchor. I made an ed discussion post about it. Just make sure you use leading anchor instead of left. It doesn't really matter, but it's just our convention. So then we want to constrain the trailing anchor to be equal to the trailing anchor. So all I did was just basically add this table view as a subview, and then constrain everything, or the entire table view, to this main view. Okay. So now the one thing that I've skipped was to actually configure this table view. And so to configure that table view, there are 3 things that you need to remember. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to register a cell to be used for this table view. So the table view cell that Richie just created before, I'm going to register that cell so that I can use it with this table view. So to do that, there's a property, or there's a function inside of this table view cell class, or table view class, called register. And then you want to use the one that says for cell reuse identifier. And then for this nib, you can just put nil. And now you want to pass in a reuse identifier. And so this reuse identifier is used whenever we dequeue the cell. So it takes in some kind of string to kind of identify the cell. So usually by convention, we create this reuse identifier inside the table view cell class. That makes it a lot more neat. And so I'm going to say let's reuse be equal to any string I want, right? It's just some kind of identifier. So we could just say bird table view cell reuse. So it can be whatever string. And now in order to actually kind of access this variable, I'm going to mark it as static. I'm not going to go too much in detail about what static means. It's kind of beyond, I guess, the scope of this course. But just mark it as static. That way, in order to access that variable, I can just simply do bird table view cell dot reuse. Okay. So actually, one thing I forgot. So instead of nil, you want to actually put in the class of the table view, or of the table view cell. So the class of the table view cell that we created was bird table view cell. So I'm just going to copy that. And if you do just that, it won't work. You have to do this thing called .self to actually get the type of that cell. To be honest, you don't really need to understand like how this entire thing works. You just need to know how to like kind of use it. Basically, what I'm doing here is to just register the cell to be used for the table view. So now that I read, oh, you have a question? Yes.
For the top and bottom anchor, does it matter if you use like the safe area layout guide?
So if you do use a safe area layout guide, it basically makes the top of the table view like kind of down here a little, because that's like the safe area. And so you don't really want that. And so you want the top of the table view to be at the very, very top. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes. What's up?
So let's say, for example, I wanted to have 2 different types of like tables, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, for example, let's say like Instagram, if I wanted to alternate between like a post and a reel, like how would you do that? Is it the same kind of code?
Yeah. So are you talking about like how you have like stories at the top that's like horizontal scrolling, and then like a mode post, or like
can you rotate it between like different types of rows? Like, can you have like, you know, like a row of class 1 and a row of class 2, and then just have like a table of like all the different.
Oh, yeah. So you're saying that each cell would be kind of different, right?
Yeah. Like, let's say we made like a dog row.
Oh, yeah. So there is a way to do that. I'll kind of explain that whenever we actually configure the cells. Yeah, I'll explain that in a bit. So first we register the cell, and then we now want to set this thing called its data source, which is basically the source of data for the table view. And then we want to set that equal to self. In addition, we also want to set the delegates equal to self. So these are the three main things that you want to do whenever you configure this a table view. Register the cell, set the data source, and set the delegate. And so now you can see that Xcode is giving me this error. And so why is it giving this error? It's basically saying that my view controller class needs to conform to this protocol called UITableView delegate. So down here I created a mark comment. And so in order to conform to a protocol, usually by convention we create an extension to do that. So similar to how we use delegation, we kind of want to do the same thing for this UITableView. So I create an extension of my main class. Now notice how this is outside of the view controller class. So you want to put it outside. So I create an extension of that, and then I provide in the name of the delegate. In this case, it's a UITableView delegate. Okay. And so now this function, or this delegate, has no required functions. And so the reason why it doesn't have a required function is because Xcode is not giving me an error. But one of the functions that you should implement is called height for row at. So if you just start typing height for row at, it will kind of autofill for you. So if I select height for row at, this basically tells me how tall I want each cell to be. So this thing returns some kind of float. So this height, I can just put 100, for example. So I'm going to return 100 here. So this is just basically saying, hey, for each row inside of this table view, give it a height of 100. Now for the data source, remember we can create an extension. We want to conform that to UITableView data source right here. Okay. Now Xcode gives me an error. The reason why it gives me an error is because I haven't implemented the functions that this delegate wants me to implement, or this protocol wants me to implement. So if I hit this thing, you can fill in protocol subs. So this is the one function that I should implement, which is called self-row at. And so, well, there's also another one called number of rows in section that basically tells table view how many rows you want to add. So remember, you got table view data source. Make sure you have these two functions: number of rows and then self-row at. And so now, if I go and look at this table view, each cell represents a bird. And so what I want to do is, with this array, configure each bird as a table view cell. So for the number of rows inside of this section, so there's only one section here. We're only going to deal with one section here. So in this entire section, I wanted to tell the table view how many cells I want. So if each bird is, or if each bird is one cell, then how many cells do I tell this table view to have? Does anyone want to take a guess?
The length of the array.
Exactly, the length of my voice just cracked. The length of the array. And so I want to return in some kind of int. So to get the length of the array, it would just be birds dot count. Okay, and then I'm just going to put return here because you're returning an int. So the length of the array is basically the number of rows that I want to have. So we have that done. Now we want to set the cell for each row. So this is kind of going to answer your question about having like different cell rows. And so first, what you want to do is this thing takes in some argument called TableView. So if you do TableView, there's a function called DequeueReusableCell. So I'm going to call that function. Now, this thing has some identifier. So the identifier that I used before was this reuse identifier. So what I'm going to do is say bird TableView cell dot reuse for, and then you're just going to pass in this index path parameter here. This index path just basically represents which row and which section you're at in this table view. So I'm going to pass in index path. Okay. So now, what I just did here is this table view, I'm dequeuing some cell with this kind of identifier. So now I want to return this UITableView cell. So I could just assign this to some variable. I can say let cell be equal to this, and then I can return cell. So basically right here, this function returns a cell. So it's basically telling this table view which cell I want to return. So the cell at this index path row, give it this type of table view cell. But there is an issue though. This right here, if I type in cell, you can see that its type right here is a UITableView cell. So this is the default table view cell that's provided by UIKit. But I don't want to use theirs. I want to use my own table view cell that I created, my own subclass of it. So to do that, you have to cast this UITableView cell into that custom type. So to cast it, you want to use this as keyword, and then to safely cast it, you add a question mark to make it optional. So I'm going to cast it as a bird table view cell. And now, because I'm making this an optional, cell right here is an optional. So usually we use a guard-let or an if-let. So I'm going to just use an if-let to unwrap the optional. So if-let cell. And then I can put this cell in here. So now if I type cell in here, you can see that instead of a UITableView cell, it's a bird TableView cell now. So now I basically just casted this into my own custom type. Now it's still yelling at me because what if, it still needs some kind of return value by default. So I'm just going to return a UITableView cell just so that it doesn't yell at me. But this code should usually never be called if you did it correctly. So now this cell is going to be returned for each index path in this table view. But how do I actually get this table view cell to be used? I would need to kind of configure it. So if you look at this image view property and the name label, each data model here, I want to pass in the name and I want to pass in the image to this bird table view cell so that I can configure it. So what I'm going to do here is create a configure function. So I'm going to say, I'm going to make it a configure function. Now what this configure function is going to do is that it's going to take in some name and then some image. And I'm going to call that in here. And so inside this configure function, it's going to take in a bird name. The bird name, if you look at the type of the bird, it's a string. The bird image is also a string. So bird name is a string. Bird image is also a string. So what am I going to do with these parameters though? I'm just going to configure these properties, these views. So I can say bird image view, set its image. Remember the image is some UI image. And then I'm going to use named, and I'm going to pass in the name of the bird image. And then I can kind of do this because I already imported the assets here. Okay, so I configured the image. Next thing, I want to configure the name of the bird. So bird name or bird name label, set its text to be equal to the bird name. Now we didn't do this over here when we configured it because when this cell is being created, it doesn't really know which text to have. We want to configure it. And so because we're calling this configure function in this other class, so if I want to call that configure function, I can do cell because it's a bird table view cell. I can call that configure function, but it's still not showing up. The reason is because this thing is marked as private. And so if I make it non-private, now I can actually call this configure method. So there's the configure method. Now the cell, I want to give it some bird name and some bird image. So what I'm going to do is just basically get some data from this table or from this array. So from the array, we had this thing called birds. So birds, to get the elements in this array, you use these square brackets. And now I want to pass in some position, some number. And so to get that position, you can use this index path parameter that we passed in. So you do index path, and then you do dot row. You can see that row, its type is an int. So just like in this image before, you can see row 0 is the first row, and then row 1, and then row 2. Using that, I can actually access these bird objects inside of the array of birds. And now because I made the count equal to birds.count, you know that there's going to be an equal number of cells. Okay. Before I move on, are there any questions? Yes.
For the TableView function, why not just make the return? Is it possible to make the return type of bird TableView cell instead of like needing to?
Yeah. So this cell right here, if you look at type, it is actually a bird TableView cell. But because of how this function works, when you dequeue it, this TableView.dequeue reusable cell function returns a generic UITableView cell type. So it doesn't know which one to use, so you have to cast it to your bird TableView cell. And then you can cast it because it's a subclass of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And so now if we wanted to use different, I guess, cell classes, then instead of casting to a bird TableView cell, we can cast it to a different type. But if we want multiple, then this index path property actually contains like a section number and then a row number. So for example, for the first row, if we wanted like a different cell class, then we can use that. But for this example, we're only going to use the TableView cell, or we're only going to use the bird TableView cell. Yeah, so that answers the question about like having multiple cells. Okay, so when I configure this cell, I want to pass in the bird name. So this data is actually a bird object. So instead of data, I'm just going to make it bird, just to make it more clear. So now this bird is a bird object. If I do bird, if I hit dot, it gives me access to its properties. So I'm going to configure the bird name, the cell's bird name, to this bird's name. And then configure the image to the bird's image. And then you can see that all these warnings went away because I conformed this view controller class to these protocols. So that's why the errors went away. Okay, so let me try running it and see if this works. Okay, so this is actually an Xcode issue. I'm just going to remove this. There you go. So Xcode is happy now. So yeah, as you can see, all of these cells are being populated. Okay. Before I kind of recap, are there any questions? Okay. So just to recap, first, whenever you want to create this TableView cell, you first want to kind of figure out how do you want to create this view. So this UITableView cell, it has an image and then it has a label. And so we first create the cell for it, just like what we did before, create these properties, configure the properties, do all of this stuff. And then the only difference is that you also need this configure method to actually configure it. And then we need this configure method because each cell is different. There's a different image for each one, a different name for each one. But how does it know which one to use? Well, this cell for row at function, it dequeues the cells with this given reuse identifier. And so you get the bird object at that position, and then you want to configure it for that bird object. And all that works because we have this thing right here. All right, any other questions? Yes.
Is each cell a bottom
Is each cell a what? Oh, yeah. So you can see how like each cell has, whenever I click on it, it's like highlighted. There's actually a function in here. I think it's in delegate. Yeah, called did select row at. So basically, this index path, for example, if I click the first one, index path would be 0. So you can say if index path at 0, if you click on it, then whatever happens to this function will be called. So if I put like print hello, and if I click on this, the console would print out hello. I don't think you'll need it for A3, but you will need it for A4. Okay. Are there any other questions?
It's like, for example, the one you just made did select row at. Is that the name of a parameter to the function? And not the user's name? Or,
Oh, right here? All right. This select row at.
like, yeah, like the thing you just used.
Yes.
Is the word after function the function name or the return type?
Yeah. So it seems weird because I'm typing in this select row at, but that's not actually the name of the function. You see how these functions have basically the same name? It just has different parameters.
Are you overloading the same function?
Yeah, they're basically the same function, but then you have different parameters. So how Swift works is that it treats it as different functions.
So if you've heard of like a different class, I think you've heard of like function signature before, right? So it depends on the function signature, which also depends on the parameters as well as the sort of return type. So you can have things defined with the same name, but if they have sort of a different parameter set or a different return type, they will be treated as a separate function in Swift.
Okay. So we're gonna start the Kahoots.
No phone number this time.
Thank God. Okay. We're gonna get started right now. First question. In delegation, the view controller that is being asked to perform a task is the what? Keyword being asked.
Wait, for the Kahoot, can you stand like control?
Oh shoot. Yeah.
For some people.
I did not. My bad. I did not know. So yeah. So the delegate is the one that's being asked. The delegator is the one that's giving the task. Okay. ML again.
Right, so in an MVC architecture, what does the C stand for?
Nice.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. So yeah, in MVC, model view controller, specifically in UIKit, is the view controller. And that's still on top.
True or false? A struct is a value type, and a class is a reference type. Yeah, so the answer is true. We didn't really go over this in lecture, but the course textbook does kind of describe it a little in like a small section. But yeah, struct is a value type. If you create a new struct, a copy of that struct, then it creates actually a new copy of it. But if you create a new variable of the same class object, it has the same reference to it. So let's see the podium. It's gonna be ML again. Nice, ML again. Okay, great job, whoever you are.
Killing it.
Okay, while y'all are packing up to leave, I'm gonna go over some quick announcements. So some to-dos. A2 again, due tomorrow night. Please fill out the assignment survey. It's 1 free point. I don't know why you wouldn't fill it out. It's 1 free point. We will release A3 tomorrow as well. If you need a partner, fill out the form. Okay.